And we can't talk about dads without talking about the moms too. So the moms, we got 21, from worst to best. And you might be, you ladies and you guys too, you might be surprised about how I have this ranked. But at number 21, the worst of the worst, we have Medusa from Soul Eater. Medusa was the mother of Korna. What was his name? Krona. My bad, Krona. Krona had the black demon blood placed in him. Ragnarok. She kept him in a dark room. She said, you had to kill people. You have to do this because it's what you're created for. You're created to be my weapon. You're my son. You're my weapon. She manipulated him, like, to great degrees. He ended up growing attached to, like, real friends after some time. But then she still came in and was like, oh, you wouldn't be in this world if it wasn't for me. You better, do what your mom tells you and, go kill those people. And he's like, I don't want to. And then he ends up betraying them. But then, she, like, Maka understood that, he had to because, pulling on his heartstrings, that's his mother, and eventually Corner just is like, you're not a good person, I can't. But she's at 21. I got at 20, I have, hold on, where's 20 at? The Divine Deity from Seven Deadly Sins, the god of the Goddess clan. She, the Supreme Deity, right? She put a curse on her own daughter because she liked a demon. She's like, you like that filthy demon? She says, I'm going to put a curse on you, and you're going to have to, die and reincarnate every time. And every time you find Meliodas again, you'll die. You will die every time you find Meliodas. Every time you meet him again, you'll die. You do that shit to your daughter, that's not a good mother, That's all I'm saying. You can't just let that shit be and let their relationship, do what it does. You have to, make shit more difficult. No different than the Demon King. They're both low as well. She's at 20. At 19, I got Irene Belsarion. Irene Belsarion was like, I'm pregnant with Urza. Urza's father was like, no, you're not the woman I fell in love with. All of this played into her, like, being like, and she kept Urza inside of herself for a long time. That's what you guys gotta understand. She was a dragon for a long time, and she kept Urza inside of her stomach until Zera finally showed up. And when Zera showed up, some time had passed, a long time had passed. And he's like, I hadn't seen dragons in a long time, but you're still walking around. And he, like, understood that she used to be a human, and he's like, I could, like, change you back to being a human, but then you have to, like, still deal with, because it's not a, like, permanent thing or anything like that. She was then like, I want to reincarnate inside of the baby that's inside of me, and basically relive her life through Urza's body and shit. She takes over Urza's life, basically. I don't like shit like that. That don't sound cool. Ultimately, she didn't do that. But what she then did was fight against her daughter, and she was, fighting against Urza for, Zareth, in the Alvarez Empire arc, and she broke her bones and all kind of shit, almost killed her and Wendy, you know. Ultimately, she killed herself, though, because she couldn't bring herself to kill her own. But, like, she just was still trying to do it, though, and then she was, she didn't do it, though, but those thoughts were there, and, you don't do that shit. That shit's crazy. I got her at number 19. I got Kaguya at 18. Kaguya, she did raise her sons. She didn't want her sons to die, but she wanted to manipulate their lives. She wanted to fuck around and play games with them. She even turned Homura against, the Sage of the Six Paths. The Sage of the Six Paths, he had to, go against his brother and then turn the tables on her and fight their own mother. They were nice enough to seal her away. They sealed the bitch up. They could have probably packed the bitch up themselves, honestly. I think they could have, but that's their mother. They didn't want to fucking do that, but she was still kind of like, upset and salty about it. But she's an alien, and her species comes down and feeds on, people, and then, that's kind of how they work. But they didn't know that. They're half-breeds. Their father was a human and shit, right? But she fought against her sons, and like it destroyed the world almost. And they were like, we never knew you to be that. Like, you were a woman who was, very, kind to people, and then you were hiding things from us. You were taking people to a tree and killing them. A girl that I liked, I could have, around with her, and that's how he awakened his Sharingan eye. That's how Hagoromo awakened his Sharingan, because his mother did some fucked up shit like that. At 18 though, I have Kaguya Otsuki. And then I have Yusuke's mom at number 17. Yusuke's mom, man, she's a heavy drinker. And she, went and she, drank a lot. I guess it was because Yusuke's father left her. But either way, you don't do that shit. Because now Yusuke's running around fighting people all the time. And, not going to school like you want him to. But you're like, not even like... And he knows this. He's like, he takes advantage of it. You don't even care. Like, I can leave the house and I could be doing anything else but going to school. You won't even know. I could just tell you I went to school today, and she'll be like, and she's like, okay, you went to school and came home. She ain't really like looking into what he's doing or anything like that. You went to school and you came back home. Okay. Not, doing that shit too much, not checking for grades, not, not doing none of that shit, just like, hey, okay, still, and then he comes back dead, and then she's like all crying and shit, then she's like, oh no, my boy's dead, and she's all, sad and still drinking, and he's like, oh, and he sees her and he's like, damn, my own mother, she's sad, and I don't want to see her sad, but, I don't know. She didn't do too much for Yusuke. She brought him into the world, though, so we gotta give her some credit. And he's a great character, right? So, 16, we got Big Mom. And I know people might be, doing other things about Big Mom, but I'm like, Big Mom, she, like, I swear to God, like, I don't give a fuck what any One Piece fan says. This hoe was playing games. She's like, fucking this guy to have, like his like benefits of like, oh, Charlotte Linlin's a powerful pirate. We'll come to help her out anytime she needs help because she's married, this guy and had a kid with him. And they have kids together, and she's done that with like so many different guys. She fucked around and created an empire off of her, self. That's why she's named Big Mom Charlotte Linlin. She had, a good idea to, create a crew full of like in the family, and she had that working for her, but she had killed one of her sons and shit, like, I don't know, man, like, you don't do that shit. You don't fuck around and play games. Like, bitch, you don't kill your son who you like raised up and, given positions of power and said, you're the minister of this, that's my son so-and-so. And like, I think she did know each of her sons and shit. She did. Somehow she still remembered all that shit, but like, she's still going through her hunger pains. But like, that's the thing. When she went into her hunger pains and shit, she started to like let all that shit go out the window. She didn't give a fuck, if you didn't drop, and do what she told you right then and there, even if it was like some shit that couldn't be like done, she would take your lifespan away. She killed Opera. They they were like, our big brother Opera, our brother Opera is dead, because she, snatches, life away. And like that, she does, he wasn't even a bad son. He's sticking with her. He's not like leaving to join Luffy. He ain't doing something like that. She's just a stupid bitch who like wants to be like, you need to do that now. And he's like a grown ass man and shit, and he's like, hey, mama, calm down, and he just snatches his lifespan away, and he's done. I don't know. You could have her higher, but she ain't the best, man. Come on now. 15, I got Ur from Fairy Tail. Now, she was concerned about her daughter, Oltir. Oltir was born with, like, a lot of magical power, or, like some type of, thing. She's like, I don't know what's wrong with my daughter. I need you guys to fix her, you know. And she was like, I'll come back for you. And she did come back for her. That's the thing. Or didn't just leave her there. She came back when she was supposed to. They played games with her. The doctors there played games with her, and they were like, "Oh, your baby died when we were doing tests on her. She died during the testing period, so she's dead now." And then she cried for a long time. And then when Gray and Leon came in, and she was trying to like fill that void, a little bit, and she did, still care about Oltir, and I think a part of her knew that she was still, wanted to believe she was still alive, but she kind of had to, like, write it off and just, figure shit out with Gray and Leon. And she wasn't going to see those two boys die, so she had to give her life to defeat Deliora. She's not a bad woman, a mother, but she just wasn't there, and she kind of gave her to her. She put too much trust in another, people who she thought was going to fix them, but she didn't do her research enough. And Oltir ended up becoming some evil bitch, a little bit. But she was still bad, Oltir is like, oof. But, she ended up, going down a dark path. But then she came back, not just in time. But, I got her at 15. And then I got at 14. Where is she at? 14. I got Lichita. Lichita is the mother of Asta. Asta's mother, she had the ability to, like, take other people's magic and shit. And, she didn't want to do that to her baby. And, like, because, like, when your magic goes to 0, you die. And she didn't want to deal with that. She didn't want to kill her own son. She was like, I'm just going to kill my son, if he stays with me, because my powers work like that. I take people's magic away, and she had to give him to, somebody else. She wished the best for her son, but she couldn't do for him. She couldn't figure out something to change herself, and I guess we can't blame her too much because, we didn't know that, Lucifer was going to try to manifest, and then she then died. And, maybe she did have plans to go see Asta again. Once she figured out what was wrong with her and how she could figure out herself, but then she also had Liba too. She kind of like had Liba, like kind of like in the like Aura situation. She had Liba to fill the void of Asta, because she's like, I had a son and, I had to leave him, but, you're here and you can actually, be around me and stuff, I don't know. But Lichita, she ain't a, bad woman, she would have been a better mom for Asta, but, things didn't work out that way. She ended up dying, passing away, so we have her at 14. And then at 13, we have Sesshomaru's mother. She's a demon. She don't like humans and shit. And, like, that's a thing that might get her points off with other people. But if you pay attention to what she did, she allowed Sesshomaru to come to her, and he's like, oh, my son, you haven't seen me in a long time. And he's like, yeah, what's up with this, like, NATO's on Getsuha and all this other thing. And she's like, letting him know what's going on with that and, like, what his father's intentions were for him. And then she like let him know, you brought this girl back to life already, right? And he's like, yeah, you can't bring her back again. It's only a sword that can be used one time. You have to understand that life is actually special, and you don't get a redo like that. you know it ain't something that is just, you can keep coming back, but you can't just do that. you know so then she was like, you have, you know this one chance. I can bring it back one more time, but this is it. you know Being a motherly figure to him, she knew that that was gonna like make him upset. And she was like, I don't want to see my son upset. She put her own whatever aside. I don't like humans. I'm a demon, and not just any fucking demon. She's that bitch that I was fucking with Toga, right? But I'm gonna let this girl live because it's gonna make you, my son, happier. And that's what you do for your son. And he's a grown man and other things, but she's still like, yeah, that's my boy and shit. And I don't want to see him, upset. So she is at 13. you know, Arguments to make her higher if you wanted to, really. Now I have Kushina at 12. People might, killing her having Kushina low. I have Minato low too, though. They weren't in Naruto's life enough, but like they wanted to. It's a sad thing with them. It is, you know, they couldn't help that they had to, like, she didn't know that she was gonna get sought after by fucking Obito to like get the Nine Tails attracted from her. She was gonna die anyways. But that's the thing. She was gonna die. Minato could have lived. Now that's the thing. Minato could have lived, and he could have, but she couldn't have. She didn't. She couldn't have lived because she was the Nine Tails Jinchurikyo. Now she stayed alive longer because she was of the Uzumaki clan lineage, but like she's still a Jinchurikyo, so she's still gonna die, regardless. So then she got some of her chakra sealed within Naruto, and later on when Naruto was trying to gain Kurama's powers, Kushina's chains came down and, held down Kurama so he could fight against Kurama, and she liked Naruto. Naruto and her kind of have that, like, loud, kind of like that, loud personality. When Naruto gets loud and he starts, being, a little bit rambunctious, it's kind of like the Red Habanero, his mother. He gets that from his mother, you know. And, she was, she cared about him. She was like always asking about Naruto. She was asking about Naruto when she was on her deathbed. Is Naruto okay? Minato, is he okay? And he's like, yes, he's all right. I'm making sure that, half of it's sealed inside of him, and then we'll be sealed inside of him too. Part of our energy will. So he has it in the future, if he ever needs it. And, that's all I can say, and had she, survived, I'm sure she would have been a decent mom. But she's at 12. At 13 or 11, I have Ed and Al's mom, Trisha. Trisha was there for Ed and Alphonse even when Hohenheim left. Hohenheim left because he knew that Trisha was gonna die, and Trisha knew too, but Trisha was kind of like heartbroken a little bit, And Ed and Alphonse, were kind of like, what the fuck did Dad leave? And she had to deal with that, and like, your father left, but I don't know, he might come back, I don't know. She had to kind of like, be there for him and other things that she was. But then she died, and then, they tried to bring her back to life, and they couldn't. That's some shit that can never happen. But she was there for Ed and Alphonse. They loved their mom so much they tried to bring her back. It's a sad thing that happened to them. She's at 11, though. Only because, and then she can't help that situation out. It's just these other women have been there or had more kids and did things. She's not a bad woman, though. Trisha wasn't a bad woman. Definitely a good mother. But I have Sora at number 10. That's Sanji's mother. Sanji's mother, couldn't see her other kids, because Judge was like, you jump off a building, you fight those soldiers, those artificial soldiers we make. You beat that guy's ass. You do this, you do that, all her sons. And then, they kind of were just like, animals, machines at that point. You know, did they care about their mom? They probably didn't see their mom that much. You know, Judge wouldn't let her them see her. Um, but she probably cared about them. I wouldn't put it past her. You know, she probably did care about those boys and shit. You know, but you know, she also heard from Sanji that, oh, my brothers beat my ass and, you know, other things because, you know, they were, you know, more favored by father. And she was like, oh, it's okay, Sanji, come here. You know, it's all right. And all this other thing, you know. And then Reiju, you know, would go see her too. And you know, Reiju and Sanji were the ones who were upset when she died. You know, she took the toxins when Sanji was born so that, you know, he wouldn't come out like the other ones. You know, because she understood what Judge was doing, trying to create an army of, you know, super enhanced humans. You know, she, you know, goddamn, she was not the one that was wrong. You know, and then, you know, Sanji's love for women kind of stems from that, and you know, also just being a guy. But you know, he loved making her food and shit. You know, and you know, she died. You know, he had no reason to stay, and Reiju knew that, and Reiju was like, you know, nobody here really gives a fuck about you, Sanji. You have to get the fuck out of here. You know, you have better chances out to sea. You know, and she, you know, was probably the reason why he stayed longer too. You know, because of his mother. When his mother died, then, you know, things got worse. But she's at number 10. At number 9, I got Nico Olivia. I don't know. I should have probably had that switched around. But Nico Olivia is kind of like Dragon a little bit, you know. She don't want to bring that on her little girl, you know. I'm a scholar of Ohar, and I understand that we looking into things that the world government won't like us doing. You know, I have a daughter. I need you to watch my daughter. You know, please. You know, and Robin, you know, she was there for a little bit, and then she had to dip. You know, and she came back, but it was fucked up too. You know, the day she came back was the day she died, and the day, you know, the whole, you know, village died. You know, they got burnt the fuck out by Akahinu and the Marines. You know, she did care about Nico Robin. You know, Nico Robin knew that was her mom, but she was like, I'm not your mother, but you have to leave, you know. And she was like, I don't want to, you know. I know you're my mom, and, you know. So it was like, you know, I have to take her, you know, because she's a, you know, kid and other things, and she has to survive. You know, it's going to be hard for her, and it was, but, you know, ultimately she had to, you know, give up that relationship with her mother. You know, her mother, you know, was a scholar, and she did what she had to, you know, keep that information, you know, alive, you know, about, you know, the Void Century and everything else. You know, she was a scholar just like, you know, Mr., you know, Clover and, you know, Vegapunk, you know, I guess found some of the shit that she had given to, you know, them or whatever, you know. She didn't have much time with Nico Robin, but Robin didn't hate her mother. She didn't. I would never say that Robin hated her mother, you know. She understand the situation was really fucked up and what they did to her was fucked up, you know.